So after doing all of this work, right, for many years, I kept coming back to the stark realization that shame is still there. Right? We've worked with it, we've healed it, we've moved it, right? And each one of these processes is insanely important in its own way, but actually, in some essential way, right, shame doesn't actually move. So why? So why? And then, about 10 years ago, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, I realized, oh my fucking God, there's an entire other level of shame that's beneath that, okay? And here's where it gets kind of wild and crazy and beautiful, and this is where we can do the healing. This is where it happens. You see, you can't skip these 3 stages. And you get what I mean when I say we could do a day on healing the story of the shame. We could do a day on noticing, a day on first level of engagement, a day on the second level of engagement, a day on the third level of engagement. And I hope that some of you who are leaders will with your people. Okay, it's critical to do. But then you run into this realization that actually, right, shame is still there, even after you've parsed the whole thing. And you can't skip it. There's no bypass. You can't bypass to where we're about to go. But after you've done all 3 of these levels, you realize that there's still an even deeper level of shame that I want to give it a name. I want to call it the shame of finitude. And finitude means my very physicality, my mortality, right? My very embodied, right? Infinite is infinity. So finitude, you got that word, everybody? Finitude? Finitude is the opposite of the infinite. Does that make sense? So there's a shame of finitude. And the shame of finitude, and I'm now going to do in like 10 minutes, like 5 hours. But I want to give you a fragrance of it, okay? So we in? We in together? Who's in? Just who's in? Just who's in? We okay? Okay, so thank you, like big, huge thank you, okay? So I want to try and, it's gorgeous, but we're not just going to put it on the table. There's actually a way in to evolve the source code and actually heal and transmute it. So this is the love story, right? Remember, we've got to get back to Eden. Where are we going here? We're going back to Eden, right? We were ejected from Eden, from the pre-tragic. We went into the tragic, right? We've been meandering in the tragic. Now we want to get to the post-tragic. So we want to get back to Eden because that's what the love story is. And if I integrate pre-modern, modern, postmodern, right, the greatest kind of traditional pre-modern structure is I want to return to Eden. So how do I get back to? We don't know how to get back because there's 2 cherubs with flaming swords at the entrance to Eden in the book of Genesis who burn us when we try and get in. And so when I go for addiction, right, when I go for all sorts of, right, excessive, right, covering up of the whole through massive acting out on addictive forms, right, those are the angels with their flaming cherubs that burn us, right, on our, what Kurt Vonnegut's son called, right, in his book on addiction, on our Eden Express. That's our Eden Express. It's dangerous trying to get back to Eden, right? There's a reason why there's 2 cherubs, right, guarding the way, right, with flaming swords. Okay, so we're going to try and get back to Eden. We're going to try and actually evolve the source code together here, okay? So there's this thing which we want to call now together, we'll call it the shame of finitude, right? The shame of finitude. And the shame of finitude at its core, first off, it evokes disgust. So I want to put the word disgust on the table. Right, it's a very interesting word, disgust. We don't talk about disgust. It's disgusting to talk about disgust, right? Yuck, it's disgusting. But there's actually a dimension of our physicality that evokes disgust. That's why we call it shit. Right? It's why we turn sexing, right, and defecation into curse words. Shitting and fucking. Or just for fun, shitting, pissing, and fucking. Disgust. Let's just first put that on the table. We could talk for a few hours about disgust. It's like, whoa, what does that have to do with king and queen? I thought I was a king and queen. Right? King and queens evoke reverence. They have authority. Right? They're in control. They're virtually immortal. And then we're shitting, pissing, and fucking. Right? Right, so there's this level of disgust, but what's it related to? So it's related to the core of the shame of finitude is a shame of powerlessness. It's a shame of powerlessness. And for some people, they only experience it if they have, some physical ailment where all of a sudden they realize that their ability to control reality has been challenged because actually a physical ailment can actually undermine them. Steve Jobs wrote that when he got cancer, he had actually experienced himself for 20 years as omnipotent. And all of a sudden, he went and he actually accessed every treatment in the world and nothing worked. And all of a sudden, he realized, oh my God, look at the shame of being in a body. I'm Steve Jobs, and there's nothing I can do. Other people experience the shame of powerlessness. Right, a dear friend of mine, when she has a hard time paying the fucking rent. And how many of us in the room have no idea what that's about? And how many of us do? But the shame of powerlessness when I'm desperate about finances. I'm desperate. And feel the shame of that desperation. Feel the shame of that desperation. Right? That they're not even allowed to share it. Because we're so shamed to share it. Right? So the shame of finitude is a shame of powerlessness. And it expresses itself in three ways. One is our experience, right, Eric, of our mortality, right, our physical mortality. And that always evokes a melody. And then the melody stops. So our physical mortality, right? And we do everything we can to deny that. And how much time do we like to spend with people who are terminal? Right? Meaning they have a terminal diagnosis. And think about bodies rotting. Because bodies rot. And the experience of our mortality, which is the experience of our finitude. And even if we may have a religious belief in an afterlife, which is no longer a religious belief, we now have an enormous amount of phenomenological information about the continuity of consciousness, which is not my conversation today. But even if I know all of that information, and we did a dialogue about a year ago I did with Andrew on death, and we talked about in One Mountain death a lot. But even if I have an actual knowing, right, that death is a night between 2 days, I still have the shame of my immortality. That this life is going to end, that I'm actually going to die, that actually this body is going to rot away. So there's a shame of mortality. And that shame of mortality is deeply connected to sexing. Because sexing, the little death of orgasm, actually is this involuntary movement of the body. Walt Whitman said, like my copulations, which means like my sex, like my death. Right? In other words, there's an experience of this abandonment of self, of this loss of self, of this disappearing of self in sexing, which on the one hand is ecstatic. On the other hand, there's this deep reminder of death, which is why so often at the end of sexing in the proverbial archetypal image, which of course doesn't apply to anyone here, but the couple, right, they roll over and go to sleep. Right? They face the wall. Right? She smokes a cigarette. Right? In other words, there's this, we just faced something together. Right? So there's a whisper of mortality. John Donne, come, my darling, that I may die with you, that I may die with you. Both in its glory, but in its, so in sexing, there's a reminder, a deep reminder, we're invaded, the body invades us, and everything else is blotted out, and I realize my end. Right? Woody Allen was not wrong when he titled the movie Sex and Death. He was talking about something. We could talk about this for several hours. I just want to touch the fragrance, just the fragrance. Second is my animality. And by animality, I don't mean my animal nature. That's way too polite a word. Right? My animality. Right? There's an essential animality to me. The shitting, pissing, and fucking, meaning underneath this rational being who's this separate self, right? Who's kind of operating in culture, and as a Homo economicus and acting appropriately according to self-interest, right? There's right underneath that, there's an animal. And there's this sense of our animality. And we're shamed by our animality. Animals don't choose, for example. We're supposed to be captains of our fate and masters of our destiny. But actually, there's this animality lurking underneath that's going its own way and doing its own thing. Right? And that animality, right, undermines, threatens, right, this public self that we're putting into the world, this enlightened self, or this social self, or this good citizen self, or this good business person, or this good kindergarten teacher. Right? Underneath, there's this animality, and there's one part of it as, wow, you say, right, he's an animal. It's a compliment in sex. She's an animal. But there's this other part where you say he's an animal. She's an animal. There's a very fine line between those two. Right? So there's an animality. So there's the shame of finitude is there's a shame in our very mortality, at our decaying bodies. And by the way, just try and grow older. My friend Sally Kempton said to me a week ago, Kate and I were talking to her, she said, I'm ashamed of my body. Right? She's 80, just about 80. Beautiful woman. Always did yoga her whole life. Right? Beautiful being. She's now about 90 pounds. Right? Said, I'm ashamed of my body. Brilliant teacher of yoga. One of the most brilliant teachers in the world. She's like, oh, my body. Right? Cha. Who can find that? Who can find that, right? Right? So there's the shame of mortality, there's the shame of animality, but the third one's the blowaway. Okay? There's an essential shame at our very experience of needing. The shame of needs. Needs. The shame of needs. And that shame of needs goes right back to the earliest part of my life where I experienced myself as being humiliated in getting my basic needs met. So the shame of finitude, the third leg in the shame of finitude, is the experience of humiliation in attempting to get my basic needs met. And when I can't pay the rent at the end of the month, remember that word recapitulate? That recapitulates the entire thread of shame. Shame leaks backwards and forwards in time. Do you get that? Shame leaks backwards and forwards in time. And each experience of shame is like exploding time bombs throughout the timeline of your life, our lives, that actually explode all the charges that were in the field. So every time you feel shame, you feel all of the shame that explodes throughout the entire system, and you're completely stunned by why you're overwhelmed by that. Here I am, this rational, good, right, competent, right being. All of a sudden I encounter shame, and boom, I'm taken out. And shame is intimately linked with needs. Now, stay close for a second. Now we take off. It's the next few minutes that this is where we wanted to get. And I am, just personally, if I can give you my interior feeling, I'm ecstatic to be having this conversation with you. I'm so excited and I'm trepidatious, right? I'm nervous. because I don't want to get it wrong. So let's pour love into each other, okay? Because every word counts here, and it's easy to get wrong, okay? So we're humiliated in getting our basic needs met. Now, let's stay really close. Western culture tells me, if you want to look for the readers here, James, Language of Emotions, Martha Nussbaum, 800-page book. I want to, by the way, admit, this is a good moment to admit, I have a crush on Martha Nussbaum. I told that to KK this morning. I said, you okay with that? She said, I'm okay with that, babe. Okay, so we're good. Okay, I have a crush on Martha Nussbaum. Martha Nussbaum she's in her 70s, and she is I've never actually, I've never seen a picture of her, but I've read her, right? And oh my God, she's hot, right? I mean, she is such a brilliant thinker. And she's, to my mind, the best living philosopher in the United States today. She's an unknown, right? It's not a name you've heard, right? But she's fabulous. Relatively unreadable, by the way. I don't know why people don't bother learning how to write, right? Which would be helpful, right? But she has a very long 800-page tract called The Language of Emotions, which in no sentence is easy to read, right? But what she's basically doing is she's basically going through the literature of Kohut, right, and of Winnicott, right, Donald Winnicott, and of Fairbairn, right, and of Bowlby, right. This is the whole attachment theory literature, and she's basically understanding that to be whole as a Western being, and this is not her words at all. Okay, I'm restating it in words she wouldn't, but what's basically it's saying, and she's right, and I read the same literature independently of her. It's Kohut and Fairbairn, right? And I read that whole literature very, very carefully some 30 years ago. It's a very, very important literature. It's Laurie's literature. It's a very particular literature, right? And Reich was a forerunner to that literature. But that literature basically says is, if you don't heal the humiliation of getting your basic needs met, you can't be whole. That's the basic Western model, if I could cut through all the literature in one sentence. Right? No one quite says it, but that's it. But here's the deal. Here's where it gets fucking crazy. So stay with me for a second. So what are the two models in Western culture for needs? N-E-E-D-S. Right? N-E-E-D-S. Just because my voice is going, just give me a tad there, okay? So I can just talk softer, okay? Thank you. So needs, what's the two basic Eastern and Western models for needs? So watch for a second. The Western model for needs comes from all of the Western spiritual traditions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, that we were all formed by directly and indirectly. And what do they say? They say that divinity is the opposite of needs. And, imitatio Dei, be like God. So track this for a second. In other words, the entire point of the entire Western canon that forms the Renaissance and beyond is that God or infinity or reality or divinity has no needs. And Aquinas spends all of his time, and Maimonides spends the first 50 chapters of the Guide for the Perplexed, right, to show that any text that seems to imply that divinity has needs, you're misreading it. The very essence and definition, says Aquinas, of divinity is to not have needs. And the ultimate injunction of the Western canon is imitatio Dei, be like God. Whatever that means to you. So you want to get out of that. Let's go to Osho. Let's go east. Let's go right. Let's go to right. Let's meditate. Okay, good. So let's go east. Fantastic. Let's go east together. Okay. Let's go to Abhinavagupta, major source for Osho. Let's go to Buddha. What's the point of Buddhahood? Balanced Buddhahood is to move beyond needs. I'm in my true self. I'm not affected by needs. Needs and desires are obviously closely correlated, tightly linked. God doesn't have needs and desires, nor does the Buddha. The Buddha has transcended in the core text needs and desires. So let me just get this straight. This is the double bind now, which exponentially explodes culture. So on the one hand, Western culture tells me that to be a whole human being, I have to overcome one of the three core legs in the shame of finitude, which is my essential humiliation at getting my basic needs met. On the other hand, whether my model's Buddhahood or divinity, but both Buddhahood and divinity, meaning both Eastern and Western visions of enlightenment, say that needs are a violation of wholeness. So need and desire on both sides of the aisle, East and West, is a violation of wholeness. And yet, Western literature, Jesus fucking Christ, right? And yet, and it's a double bind at the very heart of culture. And it took me years to see it clearly. I mean, it's gorgeous in its own terrible but beautiful way, right? So at the very heart of culture, right, to be whole, you have to overcome the humiliation of getting your basic needs met. And the model of need is such that only the anti-divine has needs, or only the un-Buddha, the un-God, the un-Buddha has needs. You get the double bind? That double bind literally lives inside of us, right? Right? And I don't mean this in an obnoxious, self-referential way. I mean I spent a decade trying to understand this. It's like, it just kept burning in me and burning until it's just slowly, she's not quick, right, to drop her dress. Right? She demands, right, that he's not quick to drop his clothes, right? And it's, until she's willing to kind of reveal to you what's happening, you just keep going at it and going at it and going. You realize, oh my God, there's this double bind underneath all those first three dimensions of shame that we talked about. There's the shame of finitude, there's mortality, there's animality, and then there's the shame, which is the humiliation in trying to get my basic needs met, which culture tells me I need to become whole, but I've got no model of wholeness, divinity, or Buddha that has anything to do with needs.